Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland, chat to some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we are delighted to welcome Evan Kidwell, who is a science fiction author. We're very excited to welcome you, Evan, to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Thank you guys for having me both, Roland and Craig both. I appreciate you guys.
I love that. I love it when people say they're fantastic. Sometimes you ask people and they're like, oh, I'm okay. It's like, no, you're fantastic. Yes, you are, Evan. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland. Yeah. So Roland's in Europe right now. His connection is a little bit choppy, a little bit delayed. That's why there's some talking over and some garbledness, but hopefully that'll all get worked out in post. But otherwise, Evan and I will just keep the conversation going without too much reliance on Roland, just so that we don't get completely messed up with the delay. But otherwise, thank you for joining us, Evan. And so I know you've written this a book, and we can discuss sort of what that is and all everything it's about. But what we're talking today is about something that is a factor in your book, and it's something that is sort of like I guess it's pretty important, I guess, to YA readers in general, sort of this idea of, social hierarchies and like power and all that stuff, and how they affect YA readers specifically, and why they're used so often in YA books. And I think I can think of plenty of examples of YA books that use that sort of dynamic. So let's first of all talk about you and your writing and how you got to this point, and then we'll go from there into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually am a new author. This is my debut novel, and my journey is probably not the same as many other authors' journeys. I have a background in insurance, not in fantasy, but I grew up reading fantasy books, immersing myself in fantasy books. I was bullied a bunch as a kid, and so that was kind of my escape away from that environment. But I was always creating characters in my head. I had a lot of, I'll call them imaginary friends. As an adult, we can identify that. As a kid, you just thought, oh, these are my friends, right? So I've always had that overactive imagination. And I was actually at a leadership conference for the world of insurance at the very end of 2023. And the keynote got up on stage and said, I want everybody to take out a physical piece of paper, not your pads, not your iPhones, not your computers, but I want everyone to take up a physical piece of paper and write down on their piece of paper something that scares them and something that excites them, but it needs to be the same thing that you want to accomplish in 2024. And so I wrote down, write my book. I had been thinking about this book for about 5 years now from a dream that I had. And so I wrote this down, and he confirmed everybody had something on their pieces of paper. And right after he confirmed all that, I'm sitting in the front row because I like to be a good student. He points right at me and says, hey, come up on stage. And so I was like, oh, okay, we're going to be doing this now. So I ended up announcing to 400 of my peers in the world of insurance that I wanted to write a book. And I remember it was funny because the first thing the keynote thought of was, oh, so you want to do like a finance book or an insurance book? And it's like, no, I want to do a fantasy book. Right? So that his whole presentation was on the nature of my book and writing fantasy. So that's how I came to get my book out there. I made a commitment on stage in front of 400 plus people that I was going to be writing a book in a year. So.
Well, it's great that you actually did it, but I guess that, that sort of pressure of like, I've just sort of told 400 people that know me, or at least are aware of me, that what I'm going to do. And now there's some accountability I have to aim towards.
Yeah, actually, if I had just written that for myself and not announced it to 400 peers of mine, I probably wouldn't be speaking to you today about my book. So.
Wow. I mean, listen, that's really good. I mean, that's like a great sort of motivator, right? I mean, people talk about that when you have goals, tell people your goals so that it gives you a little bit more pressure to try to achieve them. If you keep them secret, nobody knows that you're what you're sitting on. But
I think it's more than just tell people your goals. If you tell people like your closest friends and your spouse, You may still not have the motivation to go about doing it, but when you tell 400 potential strangers, right, and all of them are asking you throughout the year, how's your book coming along, right? It really put a fire under my butt to make sure that I accomplished that. Also, it didn't hurt that one of my colleagues coming after I got off stage, one of my colleagues said, well, you know what this means, right? He said, I was like, what? He goes, well, you're already coming to this event again next year. You can't show up next year without a book. I was like, oh, dang, you're also right. so that's my intro into to the world of authorship. But I will say I've always, like I said, I created those imaginary friends growing up as a kid as a way to get away from the constant bullying of reality. But I've always had an overactive imagination. I do remember I was watching one of the Harry Potter films with my family members, and I remember one of my family members saying, you know, who thinks like this? Like who has this kind of thing in their heads? And I was like, oh, I actually do. But that wasn't what triggered me to write my book. It was just an observation that I've always thought this way and created characters in my head. So.
Yeah, and I mean, YA specifically, it does have sort of that a different kind of dynamic than a lot of other things. Fantasy in general is more broad. I think you can do a lot more with it, right? Whereas YA fantasy often does include sort of this like group of kids that get together, and because they're kids, they don't have power, right? They need to get the power. They need to prove.
Yeah, absolutely.
That they have the power, you know, or that they can wield the power.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for not only power dynamics like the like what's in my book, but also like the coming of age stories in that youth environment, because there's a lot of things that even myself dealt with as an adolescent that they were really tricky things in real life to deal with, and trying to figure that out. Even as an adult, I've always leaned towards young adult fantasy because of that nature of like, you know, how do I figure this out for myself? How do I become who I'm supposed to be? All of those kinds of things. So there's definitely coming of age, you know, the flawed society caste system, which I know we're going to get into more here in a second here. But, you know, there were definitely things that I also wrote from a perspective of what would I have wanted to read as not only as an adult, but like as a youth. Like what would I have wanted to push me forward and what would I have wanted to strive for in that mode, right? So that has always been at the philosophy and the core of my writing, even though I'm a new author, of would I have wanted to read this and would I want to read this today, even, you know, as an adult. So
right. And a lot of adults read YA. I mean, that's one of the it sounds like when you think about the genre itself, young adult, you know, it almost puts you off of as an adult reading it, but the reality is that a big number of the readers of YA are adults.
That's right.
So I guess that idea of coming of age, of, you know, kids that you know have been treated as kids, obviously because they were kids, but now they're becoming adults. They're learning sort of what it means to become an adult, what it means to have responsibility, and what it means to have some power in over themselves and over the rest of the world. And I guess that's what sort of informs this idea that that's one of the core central tenets of YA. Right.
Yeah, it goes so much further than just becoming or becoming story, right? It is entrenched in every single one of our stories. Every single one of us have dealt with difficult things in our lives. I think that is a kind of a nature of life in general. And whether it's passing of a loved one, or whether it's hardships that really youth shouldn't be facing, but they are facing every single day, or whether it's coming to terms with who you are, comfortable in your own skin, right? Like all of those things are things that I think every single person deals with. And that's why I think it is it hits so close to home for so many people, you know, in that space, not just YA, but adults as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also that idea that I think that kids, they want to have power, and they like to read about other kids that have some, because they've felt their whole lives being ordered around by adults, and now, you know, they see it in a book where all of a sudden the kids have that sort of power dynamic, and that probably makes them feel empowered themselves.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, I remember when I was in college, I remember one of the very first instances of autonomy that I had. I remember a friend saying, hey, you want to go to the diner? And it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. That wouldn't have been allowed in my household environment. And I remember thinking, well, sure, I want to go to the diner at 2 o'clock in the morning. Why not? Right? Like, it's a 24-hour diner.
Yeah.
Let's do it. But it was such an eye-opening moment of, hey, I get the opportunity now to make my own decisions, and nobody's making those decisions for me anymore. And I know growing up as a kid, I always I loved the stories with kids with powers, whether it was Power Rangers, like the original Power Rangers, like the OG Power Rangers, or whether it was, Harry Potter or Animorph series where they could morph into animals, right? Like, those were all the kinds of things that I gravitated to as a kid, because there's a certain amount of escape, but a certain amount of like empowerment if you could envision yourself having those kinds of powers in the first place. So.
Yeah. And I mean, I think about, it's so true, because like my own kids, my one son is 17. He just got his license not that long ago. And he's generally not a person that goes out a lot. He spends a lot of time in his room, but even today he's like, oh, I'm gonna go out with his sister for lunch, and they're taking the car and they're going off to go for lunch. And I think it's great. Like, I mean, they're both sort of doing this thing that they've never been able to do before without me involved. They're, going off, and they're, it's a little bit of power they have, a little bit of control over their lives that I am not, I don't have to be part of, which I love too, right? I no longer have to be a chauffeur. So, there's all sorts of aspects of that I think can be woven into stories. So in your book, how does that dynamic show itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually have a system in my book. I call it bloodlines, and bloodlines are basically mythical beings of old have actually passed their powers along to human beings, but human beings have continued the passing of those powers on genetically. I actually got that idea from my 4-year-old who has blue eyes, and both my wife and I had brown eyes. So I just figured, hey, if they pass powers along at some point in time, it could show back up in the gene tree later on, right? And so that's how it works in my book. It's a completely parallel world to our world. I did that on purpose because I wanted the freedom and flexibility to build the world the way I wanted it to be, without having to necessarily follow the rules of our world, right? But the bloodline system that exists, kids unlock actual powers. Now, there's more than just powers in my book. There's a whole magic ecosystem that exists inside my book as well. Because if mythical beings of old could have passed powers on to human beings, they could have passed powers on to places and things like that as well. And so, there's environments in my book that are very magical filled. And so, but the caste system that exists, basically the government that exists today wants to make sure that students unlock their powers as fast as possible so that they know where they place them correctly. They had an issue about 30 years ago where they didn't have a system in place, and people would show up with powers in the wrong bloodlines, and it caused chaos and almost a civil war. So they created this trial system that exists inside my books, and the trials are not just intense. They are meant to break the students down on every level, mentally, physically, team, like all of these levels. They're, for all intents and purposes, they're almost a version of torture, because it unlocks the kids' powers sooner so that they can place them into the societal hierarchy sooner rather than later. And in addition to that, which powers kids unlock, because they could unlock a dud power. I call it in my book, I call it shimmer. They could unlock a dud power, but as long as they fall into that hierarchy system, they don't actually care. So which power they unlock is not actually as important as where they fall into this societal hierarchy. And I think from my perspective, it really mirrors much of what we're seeing in society today, right? Like, where do you fit? Where do you belong? All of that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I guess, when kids are in school, they often fall into different peer groups that, mirror that sort of thing where it's like, okay, these are the kind of these are the, I don't even know. I'm too old now to know what the groups are. I remember in my day, we had the goths and the cool kids and the nerds and the thises and the that's. Now, who knows what the groups are. Now it's like the kids that wear the pants around their ankles pretty much.
That's funny.
Um,
Just
Yeah.
tagging on that for a second, I was total nerd kid, right? Like that was me. I didn't have a ton of friends in not only junior high and high school, but even as far back as elementary school. But I was a kid that would read books, or I would play video games, or and so I wasn't. I wouldn't necessarily classify myself as an extreme nerd, but I definitely was the kid that would play with like Yu-Gi-Oh cards, Pokemon cards, right? Like I was that kid, right? So, and my wife today, I've been married with her for going on almost 10 years now. She'll joke with me. She'll be like, man, you're such a nerd. And now as an adult, I own it. But as a kid, man, that really bugged me. I'm not a nerd.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. We've learned to own ourselves. So that's sort of like the parallel then, like you have, so instead of in these fantasies, YA worlds, instead of coming up with all these silly little, they all have Pokemon, you break them down into like these powers that they have, these, they're put into their special groups based on their abilities, whether they're royalty sometimes in some books, but we figure out these other ways to classify people. And I think, power is one of those really, really important ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So each kid has a power they've unlocked. Some kids unlock 2 powers. That's a big no-no in my society, even though like it's possible because 2 parents, right? You can imagine that might make sense, but those kids are actually completely outcasted from society altogether because it doesn't fit into that nice hierarchy that exists. And so, obviously there's some underlying themes that might exist there in further books because this is the first in the series, right? And so, but I also made it very clear in my books that where you landed could be detrimental to you because. For example, in my book, very early on, I have one of my characters, her name is Fangle, and her parents were both angel bloods, and they gave birth to a fairy blood. And very early on, they figured out she was a fairy blood because of the powers that were manifesting, and they outcast her from the family. Like she was no longer a part of their family at all. I did that on purpose because I wanted it to be clear that the societal rules that existed were more important than family even, right? Like that's how it's become in my society. And so, and that obviously can create a lot of tension points for me to work with as I'm writing as well. So that has been a fun thing to work with, even who your friends are in that capacity. If you have a power, you don't want to associate with someone who doesn't have a power. It's just a big no-no. And even though you can, it's just highly frowned upon, and it almost forces the kids to only be peers or only be friends with those that are in their own groupings. And if you're going to be the one that stands out and is friends with somebody else, that's a problem. And that was me as a kid. I was the kid. I was not athletic as a kid. I was the kid that would always get picked last on teams because nobody wanted me on their team. I was resilient as nobody's business. Actually, my main character unlocks a power based around resilience. That was the whole idea, right? But I was resilient as a kid, but I just didn't get picked, and I was bullied, and nobody wanted to hang out with me. Nobody wanted to be on a team with me. And it's a very isolating, lonely feeling like, why does nobody want me? Why does nobody I've got the biggest heart on the planet. Like if you knew who I am as a person, I've got a huge heart. I love people. I love serving people, right? But nobody wanted me around. And it went even as far as my own personal psyche growing up as a kid. I genuinely got convinced, like in the high school era, I was genuinely convinced that the only person the only guy that girls seemed to like were the bad guys, were the guys that would just treat them like trash, would not like the nice guys finish last. I started reinforcing that story in my head, right? And I genuinely started thinking like I need to become a completely different person in order to like find someone who's open and willing to date me. And that was a sucky feeling. And I finally, as an adult, but it wasn't until I was late 20s where I finally was like, you know what, screw it. I'm going to go ahead and do what's right for me. And then shortly after that, I met my wife, and we've been married for 10 years now. But man, it was a struggle, you know, in my teen years, as well as going into my early 20s in college, everything. It was like, why is it that I have to change who I am fundamentally as a person just to get someone to even look at me, right? And that's a narrative that stuck with me for a long time. So.
Yeah, and I mean that's probably something that a lot of kids can sort of relate to, even kids that you know on the outside you think, oh well, they don't have any problems because they are in part of this group, or they come from money, or they whatever. There's always something, especially with a kid, that makes them feel inadequate. There's always something that they don't fit in right with, and so they blow it up into a bigger thing in their head, right? So even those people that you think have it all, you often find out, walk a mile in their shoes and you'll see that they have issues too. And I think that's one of the reasons why these kind of stories resonate so well, because it's not, you might think that not every kid would feel that, would be able to put themselves in that position because they weren't, the outcast necessarily as you might define it, or as you thought of as yourself, but they all sort of felt that way. Most kids feel that way in some aspect, right? So it's a really powerful storytelling feature to include that, because I think that it really can draw people in regardless of what their experiences are.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, that was my mission. Regardless of what your history or experiences have been, this is a book that you can enjoy, that you can relate to. There are going to be components that you relate to and somebody else isn't going to relate to. I remember one of the main characters in my book. I wrote her, and it was just more of a this is an important character vibe to have in my book. She had some humor to her and all of that kind of fun stuff. But my own brother said that character was my favorite character in your whole series. And when he told me that initially, I was like, really? Like, why not one of these other two characters? Like, I personally relate to these other two so much better. And he goes, no, this character over here. And so it's just interesting, like where you find your inspiration, not only in my book, but in other people's books and writings and stuff. And I think my book, I hope, has a lot of that where anybody from any background can really relate to it. So, yeah.
I think, having that diverse cast of characters is always the most important, right? Because like you said, you might not relate to this one specific character and think that this other one is sort of like, I just created them as a sort of foil for this one. But then other people are like, but that's the one I really relate to. So it's that means that you've written it well. You've written a good cast of characters, and they're not necessarily like flat and one-dimensional. It's like, oh, okay, well, I don't really care about this character, so he's just a voice, right? But obviously he wasn't, because someone else found something in them. So
that's right.
It means you did a good job. Are there people that don't have powers at all, I guess?
Yeah. So in my book, I
more
call
of an outcast.
They're not as outcast as the anoms. So anoms are the people that unlock. There are two types of people. Either they're people that unlocked two powers, okay, and so they don't fall nicely. You can't say, hey, you're in dragon blood, which is top, and goblin blood, which is bottom. Like, you can't do that. It doesn't make sense, right? There's not like an averaging between the two, right? So there's anoms are those individuals, but they're also individuals who broke the rules of society. Like, if you break the rules that they put in force in front of you, you automatically become anom, regardless of whether or not you had powers or not, right? And so that's like the outcasts. The people that don't unlock powers, I call them non-crees or non-creatures, right, for short, in my books. That is actually who my primary protagonist starts out. That's who his group of friends is. I did that on purpose, right? And so he does end up unlocking a power, but without going into too many spoilers, only 1 or 2 people actually find out about his power. His mentor actually tells him not to reveal his power because it's one of those dangerous powers that is considered not only it's dangerous to society, right? So his power he unlocks is called minor luck, and basically it's like there's lots of bad luck and maybe a little bit of good luck, but it is a balancing of the scales, and most of the bad luck seems to happen to Timaeus, right? So, but his mentor explains to him, like, this could be seen, if they can't control it, this could be seen as a negative power to society. So, but yes, so those that are the non-Cree status, they actually typically coming out of school, they'll be the servants of those that have the higher bloodlines. But I also have a fundamental, I'll call it a fun thing that I've done in my books as well, because in school specifically, while they are isolated, like where their dorms sit is further away, so they have to walk further to their relative classes, or to eat, for example, they have to walk practically the whole campus just to get to something to eat. They are from a food standpoint, because the non-Crees have not very good food, moldy bread, moldy cheese, that kind of stuff. Well, they actually entice almost all the student population to really great food while they're on campus, because their goal is, if they are going to become these servants of these higher bloodlines later on, that maybe they can be enticed and become almost spies for them and make sure people are still following their rules. So I've added that kind of layer in there of anyone could be a spy. Nobody knows who those people are. So you got to be very careful what you say and how you move and all of that kind of stuff. You got to make sure it matches up with what society expects of you. So, but yeah, so there are non-powered individuals in my book. They're called non-Crees. There are also anoms, which are multi-powered individuals, but they are outcasts as well. So, and I hint very heavily at there are fates worse than death. And I don't go too heavily into that in the first book, but it will become a trend for future books. So,
right. Okay, so the idea of the caste system, the power systems, and we talked a little bit about this and why it is that at least on the very surface level of why it is that it hooks sort of YA readers, right? Because that's sort of one of those things that they crave in their own lives, right? But what else is it that you think that really draws it in? Why is this such a core tenet? When I'm thinking about different, and I mean, I read YA, but not like a huge amount, but most of what, I've read the big ones, Hunger Games, I don't know if Harry Potter is considered YA, Maze Runner, those type of things, but they all do sort of have that sort of same idea of these different levels of society, different caste systems, different powers. What is it about that you think that really draws? Is it simply just this idea that as young adults, they're just starting to figure out where their power level in society in general, and that's what draws them in, or is it something deeper?
I actually think it's something deeper. So if I had to take a guess, now again, I'm no longer YA, right? But I've even to this day, that's where I gravitate towards when I'm reading books. That's what I find as a good read is usually a YA book. I think it goes deeper. I think fundamentally, as a human being, every single one of us wants to imagine that we can implement the change that's going to make a difference in the world. Right. And a flawed society caste system puts us right in that space where we can be the ones or we envision the main character being the one to make a change and a difference in the world. Every single one of us wants to have meaning and significance in our lives. That I think is a human trait. We all want to feel significant. We all want to feel cared for and loved and appreciated. And if a society doesn't have those components and somebody has to overcome to get to that place, then part of it is the overcoming. Like I relate to people that overcome in their stories. But part of it is that almost that hope that we all cling to, which is I want to make a difference. I think I can make a difference. I think I will make a difference. None of us wake up in the morning thinking, I'm not going to make a difference today. We all think, I'm going to make a big difference today. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. And I think that those power and caste systems, like X-Men was a good example growing up as a kid, right? Like you always sided with the, Professor Xavier and well, maybe you didn't. Maybe you sided with Magneto. I don't know, right? Like, but the point is, either side had their views and their goals about how they would change the world and make it different, right? And so, it's, and I also think there's something we said about the underdog story, right? I'll use an example in some of the films that I love, and those are like Jackie Chan films. If you watch how he does his fighting, he's always at a disadvantage. Like every single time, it doesn't matter. He's at some disadvantage, and he comes out on top. You're like, woohoo, that was an awesome fight scene. He beat the guy with a paperclip, for example, right? Like, and so I think the underdog story can really come to life in that kind of setting where the world is out to get them, right? When we as humans don't love living around like tragedy and trauma necessarily, but we love reading it and seeing ourselves in that and seeing ourselves overcome in that as well. And so I think there's something we said about that underdog side of it as well. It automatically creates an underdog environment when you have a flawed society caste system like that.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. I think a lot of the stories that are really the biggest ones are often about the underdog story, Hunger Games, Katniss, and, even Harry Potter, even though he had all the power, he was still considered, like, people still thought of him as this, like, useless kid, and, he had to overcome all the stuff. And even though they on one hand, they're saying he's going to change the world, on the other hand, they don't want to give him the ability to do so. You see that a lot. In that kind of a story. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So when you're planning something like this, I mean, it's a big endeavor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to come up with, in a fantasy world, you've got to come up with the entire world, right?
Mm-hmm.
In most other stories, that the world part's taken care of already. You just set it in normal times, and you don't have to think about how government works, how religion works, how magic, because it doesn't exist, works, all that stuff, right? Even sci-fi, it depends on how far advanced you go, but you could take that sci-fi and just change one thing. Oh, this is our world, but except for this one thing.
Yeah.
But fantasy, it's almost always you've got to come up with a whole other world. You've got to come up with a new environment, a new set of rules for how people act and react in government and social norms and religion and and then in yours, the caste system and the origins of all that stuff and how it all fits together. So take us through that process of how you built that to all make sense and fit together.
Yeah. So first of all, as a new author, I got a lot of help from specifically I had a writing coach that really helped me to understand. I'd be able to bounce my ideas off of him. And I remember, so my writing coach I took a class from him, but he was very open with his feedback with me back and forth. And so I remember asking him questions as a new author, like, for example, I'll give you a direct example that came from him. I was really struggling. The first, I'll call it half of my manuscript that I had written. It was my primary character was commuting to and from school. I was trying to show like the poverty he lived in while he was commuting, that kind of stuff, right? But even though I was actually a student who actually I walked to school or rode my bike to school, so I had lots of time on my hands to create these characters. It becomes really, call it, not exciting when you're talking about somebody walking home from school, or like, unless they're getting beat up every day, which did happen to me too. But the point is, like, that also became its own struggle of like, I already did a scene like that. Like, I don't want to repeat it, right? I want to do something like, but I want to keep readers engaged. And I again, my philosophy went back to what would I want to read, and so. I remember being really struggling with that component of commuting to school because I wanted him to live on campus. I wanted everybody to live on campus. I wanted it to be a school away from the home and you build your own community and all that kind of stuff, much like how college was for me. But I didn't want it to feel like Harry Potter from that standpoint, because Harry Potter, they lived in dorms and on campus and all of that kind of stuff, right? And so I remember having this conversation with him, and he said, look, first of all, everything that's been done like out there in the universe has already been done. I guarantee you there are books out there where they commute to school, and there are books out there where they live on campus. Like both of those sides have been done. It's not a new idea. So write from what you feel you would want to read and from what you feel the story needs, and not from oh shoot, if they're living on campus, that's too much like Harry Potter, right? He goes, don't copy anybody, but write what you want to write from that perspective. You can edit later, and so I actually went back, and at that stage, I had already written about half the manuscript. I then rewrote the scenes coming from a perspective of being on campus, right? Also, I think as an author, it's if you want to, so there's pros and cons to both sides. If you want to you want to do an urban fantasy based on our current world, the way it exists, right? Even though it's fantasy, there's lots of authors that do that. Great, go for it. But you are going to be required then to do a bunch of research as well to make sure that your world isn't breaking the rules of the current world, right? And so I actually didn't want that to hinder my creative process. So I actually thought to myself, nope, I'm going to create my own world. It is a parallel world. It feels very much like you might feel in our world here. But there are, like I said, like magic environments, for example. Like I created an enchanted gardens. I created new terms in my world and definitions for how those things work. I am, out in the authorship world, you hear of like, planning it out or pantsing it as you go. I kind of did the pantsing as you go, but when I think of one idea, I'm like, oh shoot, it'd be really cool to incorporate these other things into that idea, or these other characters into that idea, right? And so I tried to write from that perspective of adding additional Easter eggs as I went, for that kind of congruency that made a lot of sense to readers as they went through. But I created new words and terms, and sometimes that was pretty easy to do. There was an instance where I was describing from my books, there was enchanted gardens, and one of the trees basically was still in winter, right? So everything had bloomed in spring, everything was beautiful, right? But one of the trees was still in winter. I called that REM bloom, right? Like it was still stuck in like a REM cycle, but for nature, right? So and so it just, sometimes it kind of just came to me, and sometimes I really had to just sit down and think. And, instead of just writing, although I did do that too, I had to just kind of think, okay, what do I want the magic to feel like in this moment and in this world? And so it's not easy to do by any means, but I would much rather allow my creativity to move forward rather than be stuck to the rules that currently exist, which is why I created my own world.
Right. And I think that allows you a lot more creative freedom. Like you said, like you don't have to worry about, that's one of the benefits. There's a lot more work to creating your own world, but you don't have to adhere to specific rules. You just make them up, and the ones that serve your story best. And yeah, I totally agree with what your writing coach was saying. I mean, you're never going to have that like completely unique idea, or it's super rare to have that. You're always taking something that has been done before, but that doesn't matter. I mean, every person is, every male has got some things in common with every other male. Doesn't mean they're all living the same life. Everybody in insurance isn't necessarily the same person, right? So we're all seeing that. I mean, I even remember one of the first fantasy book that I ever read was by Piers Anthony. It was part of the Xanth series, where everybody in the world has one magical ability. Sort of similar, it's not like yours exactly, but it's everybody has this one thing, right? And I started with they're all standalone books, so I started right in the middle, but eventually I went back and read them all. And I remember the first one is about somebody who seems to have no power, right? Mm-hmm. And then by the end they find out they actually do. They didn't know what it was, and it's not, right? So but that doesn't mean it's the same as your book, right? Where the person doesn't know he has power. Like that's been done before, right? But it's in a completely different world. It's a completely different character. It's got completely different rules. So it has nothing. You can't be like hung up on the fact like, oh, that idea was done. It was done completely different. So that makes complete sense. But when you were building all this, right, it's a lot of stuff to sort of keep together in your head. And, obviously if you're pantsing, it's even worse, right? putting it together in sort of like a story Bible that you could then refer to make sure you're not breaking your own rules.
Right. And that's key, is make sure you're not breaking your own rules. So I use this platform very similar to like a Scrivener. It's called Living Writer. I actually paid for a lifetime subscription for it. And it's, I can chunk things out and I can literally just sit there and write and then go, oh, no, I need to take that section and put it over here. And so it allowed me to then play with my thinking on things. And what was nice about seeing it in that way was I was able to then go, oh, this one scene, I can now incorporate this other scene that I've already written. And now I can add an extra context to this scene to like kind of hint at that next scene that's going to be happening later in the book. And so that was really super helpful for me. I have a little bit of a way, my wife swears I have ADHD. I don't know how true that is. I was never diagnosed, but it's probably true. But I have this ability to just compartmentalize. Well, when I'm seeing something in front of my face that's in that compartment, right, I don't necessarily see that it relates to something later in the book until I kind of see it mapped out like that. And so that was definitely a big help. And honestly, editor help was a huge help as well, because I remember there were moments in my book that I didn't give as much context as I needed to. And my editor called me out on that. My editor was like, hey, why is this? Or, I don't understand this non-Cree thing. Explain it better. Oh, I explain it in 3 chapters from now. Do I need to explain it here? And I would go back and forth with my editor on that kind of stuff as well. I did a hybrid model, so I ended up doing self-publishing, but I hired the editor and all of that kind of stuff to help me with the artwork for the cover as well as the editing of the book. But content editing was really important to me as a new author. And so it wasn't, where's the periods and the apostrophes and the commas? It was, is your content flowing? Does it make sense, right? Or do you not give enough here for us to really grab onto what you're trying to describe? Because it's in my head, right? I just didn't know if it was coming out across correctly in paper sometimes. So the best example I have of that is I have a character who's a bad guy in my book. His name is Professor Undermeyer. And Professor Undermeyer is a true psychopath. He genuinely feels no emotions. He has no real context for why he is the way he is, right? Initially, anyways, I should say. But he's a psychopath. So I just thought, okay, he's a psychopath. He's a bad guy. He doesn't like the students. He doesn't like them breaking his rules of society, right? And psychopaths have no emotions, so therefore, it is what it is. That's kind of how I just left it at that. And my editor goes, well, what's his motivations? And I go, he's a psychopath. What do you mean, what's his motivations? Like, he just doesn't have emotions. Like, there's no real motivations there. And they told me, they're like, no, he has motivations. Like, you have to describe that and define that to the reader so they can feel his motivations too. And I really had to sit with that. First of all, I don't think like a psychopath, but I had to sit and think, like, how would a psychopath think of, like, why would they get to where they are now? Like in the book, in the story, where are they at? And so I had to sit with that, and I had to create extra scenes. And this is in editing. This is like when I thought my manuscript was done, right? I had to create extra scenes that really, because I write from different perspectives, not in the same chapter, but different chapters will have different perspectives, right? And so I added those components in. It did make my story more powerful, more believable. Like the people that read my book now actually believe him as a psychopath. I remember I was at a show, and hats off to this guy. I met him at ECC, Emerald City Comic Con. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and he bought it on day 1, Friday. And he bought it, and then each day he came back to me with additional feedback and he was, I guess he used to be in the world of academics. He was like an English teacher, right? So he came back and gave me feedback each day. And then he came back on the 3rd day and he goes, I hate, like with every bone of my fiber, I hate Professor Undermeyer. And he goes, good job. Right? Like and that told me I did it right. But initially I didn't do him right. Initially, I just treated him like the kind of the cookie cutter psychopath, and therefore it is what it is. And so I will say, as an author, it's really important to dive deeper into the motivations behind your characters. And I wouldn't have known that without that feedback from that editor. So
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. We've talked before about the idea that villains need their own backstories. And just because you're a psychopath doesn't mean you're necessarily evil either. You don't have the emotion, you don't have sort of the care about what other people think. But if you're not motivated to do evil things, then you could still be that way and do good things or do neutral things, I suppose. If you look at Dexter, right? Like
Dexter's a great example.
Yeah,
Exactly.
he's a psychopath, and he's killing people, but he only kills other killers. So
Right.
he's kind of a good guy. So yeah, no, I completely understand that, and it absolutely makes sense to give all of your characters motivations for what they do, including your villains, for sure. I think though that we have come on to the top of the hour, so actually I'll let Roland step in here if he can.
I was just going to say, Evan, you have been absolutely fantastic. It's been brilliant listening to you, but unfortunately, yes, we are running out of time, the top of the hour. So before we wrap things up, we would love to hear, and everyone who's listening or watching on YouTube would love to hear, where can people find out more about your upcoming book and more about you?
Absolutely. So first of all, my primary mode is Instagram. So Evan_Kidwell_author on Instagram. You can go to my website, tomatoespark.com as well. And just make sure you spell it correctly. And then also on Amazon is my primary way you can buy my book as well. So if you just search Tomato Spark in Amazon, it will show up there as well.
Fantastic. Well, we will make sure to put a link down in the description down below. So if you have enjoyed everything Evan has said to us today, and hopefully you did, because Evan, you've been a fantastic guest, then scroll down there, click on that link and check out his books. And while you're there, you will pass that big empty comment box and make sure you leave Evan a comment and let him know how much you appreciated everything he shared with us today, or anything else you want to say. Craig and I love reading your comments. And in the meantime, click that like button, smash that subscribe button, and if you haven't already, hit that bell icon and you'll get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked, and there will be a brand new episode of Fully Booked coming out next week. So until then, cheerio.